Hello, I'm Nathan P. Butler, author of a Saga on home video and host from the Star Wars Home Video Library here on YouTube, and this is Star Wars Home Video Year by Year. This time we take a look at the year 2000, and I would note that as we head into the 2000s, as I was preparing for these episodes, I recognize that some of these episodes are going to have a lot of stuff to cover. They may be a little bit longer. So in late 2024, I did a poll within the community who watched the show to ask, what would you rather I do? Because this was meant to be a bite-sized series of episodes. Would you rather I split an episode into multiple bite-sized episodes to keep them short for a given year, or simply combine everything into one episode and perhaps have a longer episode for a given year? The unanimous response was still one episode per year, even if they're longer. So if anybody doesn't like longer episodes as we hit more stuff in some of these years, well, we can only blame ourselves. And I do include myself within the community because I was part of that discussion, though I obviously wasn't voting. So we're looking here at the year 2000. So what is going on in 2000 outside of home video that might be sort of relevant here? Well, this is the year that Wizards of the Coast pick up the Star Wars license to start producing their own Star Wars RPG. And this is also the year that Harrison Ford becomes a recipient of the AFI Life Achievement Award. You know, you got stuff, if you were to go to the ceremony, there's a little program book kind of thing. They had their little folder and pictures and slides and stuff for it. And there was also a swag bag, sort of, in that it was actually a bag if you went to the ceremony. And I bring that up because when we see the AFI Life Achievement Award in the future, we're going to see that both George Lucas and John Williams got special home video sets to go with their award that was provided to attendees at the actual ceremony. I have yet to find any evidence of one for Harrison Ford, though I'm hoping there is one out there. I know there is one. It's like a VHS set for the year after his. I've yet to find any evidence of any actual home video set to celebrate for Harrison Ford in 2000. But hope springs eternal that maybe such a thing exists. As yet, I have seen no evidence of it. But just to set this up, we will be seeing AFI Life Achievement Award home video sets for attendees in the relatively near future here. Now, one thing we see here in 2000 is the last original Trilogy VHS release in the US and in most other markets. That is, of course, as in the previous release in 97, the special editions. So we have here a full screen set, recognizable by the fact that the clear spaces that show the box underneath are vertical. As we take it off, it is this type of packaging here. And the widescreen version instead uses wider windows. But again, it's the same packaging underneath, it's just what's showing through. It came with a little advertising booklet, it came with a Jedi Knights TCG card, and each of the packages is actually designed to look like the Phantom Menace this year, which of course will be the big release of this year. So we have sort of this look. If this looks familiar to you, yes, it's what provided the inspiration for my covers of a Saga on Home Video 2nd edition. But they all have that kind of look, even numbers having white, odd numbers having black, in this case just Empire. And if you look at the labels, they have the Star Wars logo and the title underneath. And in this case, because it's widescreen, it also says widescreen underneath. That'll be important because there'll be a reissue of these in 2001 that will change the labels, and there will be an error on some of those labels. Now for these, gone are the what makes the special editions special featurettes at the beginning that we saw back in 1997. Instead, on the A New Hope cassette right before the film, there's a special feature about the making of Episode 2, focused in on the return of Owen and Beru Lars. That is, Episode 2, The Saga Continues. You can also find that if you look in other regions. One example of another region that had something like this is Japan. Basically the same kind of design here. Just using Return of the Jedi as an example, but you could find that sort of thing in Japan. But whereas in the US, your only option for that set was VHS, because LaserDisc had ended for Star Wars in 97 in the US, and Beta was long gone, CED was even longer gone, VHS was the only game in town, except DVD, which wouldn't see releases for a while yet, unfortunately. In Japan, alongside that VHS set, they actually also had the last box set of theirs for the original trilogy as well, often overshadowed by the Phantom Menace LaserDisc of the same year. But yes, there is a nice LaserDisc set from Japan if you wanted to get these, and it's basically just the widescreen films here. So A New Hope, Empire, and Jedi. And again, it's just that same little behind-the-scenes feature as the bonus. This is a CLV extended play set, by the way. This release also lets us introduce a new format that we haven't seen yet on the series that we will see pretty often because it was sort of a step between VHS and DVD in a lot of regions other than the United States. And that's what's known as a VCD, or a video compact disc, or a video CD. One of the more common ones you'll see is this set out of Malaysia. And as you would expect, it's all the same content here. So it's got that episode 2 behind the scenes thing. The saga continues about Owen and Baru. But each of the films comes in its own little jewel case for the film itself. And then the film, because of its length, for each of these is actually spread across 2 different discs to get the entire film. And it's still standard definition. It's really not great video quality because of the compression. You'd be better off watching on LaserDisc or even VHS really at this point. But it was another way to get the films, and it does have the advantage of VCD that if you play it in the computer or something, you just jump to whatever part of the movie you want rather than having to fast forward or rewind. Which I know is something that kids today are like, wait, fast forward and rewind is what? Ask your parents. Think of it like a skip button, but it was annoying as hell. And then we have another of these, this one coming out of Indonesia. I actually like this one better. It is shorter, it is more compact. And if you open it up, just a little flap here, you got the films all in their jewel cases just kind of stacked there in the center. I definitely prefer a lot of the Indonesian releases to other parts of the world, but we'll see those as we go. But of course, as we see the fading into the distance of the original trilogy on VHS in the US for the last time, we see the beginning of a new age of Star Wars home video here, in the sense that it's 2000 where we see the beginnings of the prequel trilogy on VHS and eventually other formats, for now just VHS, at least in the United States. And that of course starts with The Phantom Menace that had been released in theaters in 1999, so now it has only taken until the next calendar year, 2000, to see a home video release of a Star Wars film. It took 5 years for A New Hope, 4 years for The Empire Strikes Back, 3 years for Return of the Jedi, and the special editions did get released in the same calendar year, but that was kind of an anomaly with them being sort of tweaked reissues of old films, and also released super early in the year so that it made sense that they could still come out later that same year. For a traditional May release, this is a pretty big step for Star Wars, with The Phantom Menace hitting VHS just basically a year later. And in the US, you had some options of what you might want to pick up. This was your standard full screen release of the film. Here, notice it has packaging. It is an odd number, matching what we saw just now with The Empire Strikes Back, only in this case with Maul eyes behind everything. And that same release actually was available in a Spanish dubbed version that is lesser known in the United States as well. And you could have gotten a store exclusive option for that full screen release if you bought at Toys R Us, which is where you would have gotten this. It's a Toys R Us exclusive clamshell. The actual release inside is just the standard retail full screen release. But it's a clamshell here that has a lenticular cover. The back, the side here, you can see, but the front is lenticular. Although I would note that that lenticular cover is actually not the cover per se. It's a card. Underneath it, you do have the regular cover if you want it to sit on your shelves and not constantly be shifting with the angle that you're viewing it from. Store exclusives aren't a huge thing yet, but that's certainly coming and is going to grow over time. Now, if you wanted a widescreen copy of The Phantom Menace in the United States, you were in luck. It was available, but only in one way, and not in the way that it is sometimes being sold these days on eBay. This was the only way to get a widescreen VHS copy of The Phantom Menace in the United States. Unlike many regions where it was just available as its own little item, here it was part of the so-called Widescreen Video Collector's Edition. Is it a Widescreen Video Collector's Edition? Is it a edition for widescreen video collectors? Is it for video collectors that happens to be widescreen? And yeah, I love when the words can be played with I'm a dork. So this is kind of a special set. It is smaller than many of the special sets we've seen before, but still pretty cool. Lays out what you get there on the back, but I'm going to show you. It does open up, just kind of folds open. You get a nice little strip here, little film strip kind of thing here. This particular one is let's see, Anakin inside the pod racer, looks like. you have an abridged Art of Episode 1, The Phantom Menace book, kind of like that abridged George Lucas' The Creative Impulse back in '92. And then with it, you get, in its own slipcover, the widescreen version of The Phantom Menace. So, if someone is selling this after the fact, like now on eBay, this is not a complete product. The only way you could get this in the United States was inside the big old box that makes a farty sound when you close it. I know I'm a child. Anyway, it's also noteworthy that only the widescreen version, not the full screen version, had a special featurette on the cassette called Filmmaking Has Turned a Corner, talking about the making of the Phantom Menace. And if you really want to get into minutia, let's take a look at the label. Notice here, the way that this is aligned. It is aligned kind of indented towards the right, which means that some of the text is running into the little divot here. That was an issue. Let's grab another copy here that was actually fixed after the fact in some of the later printings of this special collector's edition to actually align directly to the left so that the divot does not interrupt the text. And if you're wondering if that applies to the full screen version also, yes it does. There's an indented one with it messing up the text, and then there's the left aligned one. My Spanish dubbed one, by the way, is left aligned. I actually don't know offhand if there was an indented one for the Spanish dubbed version. They do all include a little coupon booklet, and yes, the one that's in the Spanish dubbed version is the same English language coupon booklet. Now, as I said, I am a big nerd. I am a big dork, and one of the things I really like is to compare home video releases from market to market. And what sometimes you'll see collectors do, and what I have done, is basically to say, okay, I want to show items from across the world for a particular release. So how would I do that? I can focus in on some very common release, and then get a bunch of relatively cheap copies from different regions of that release as a way of showing those regional differences. And that is what I wound up doing with the VHS release of The Phantom Menace. It's super common, it's released all over the world, it's relatively easy to get different versions to show. So we're going to look at a bunch of them here rapid fire, but I actually have a bunch of these types of spreads in a Saga on Home Video 2nd edition in a little sidebar called Across the Galaxy. So in this case, lots of the ones we're about to see all side by side in images in the book. So let's start with the UK. Well, from the UK, I managed to wind up getting a little display piece, which is actually not a cassette, it's just a box that would be set out to tell you, hey, you can order the cassette. But then they got a release in full screen in a nice clamshell kind of case here, and they got a widescreen release that was just a standard release, also in a clamshell, but notice here, similar design to what we saw in the US, but in the US you had to get that boxed set. And in the UK, rental copies often had larger clamshell cases than retail, so we have here a rental version of the full screen copy of The Phantom Menace as well. Then also for my own collection here, we have one from Greece, we have one from Taiwan, we have one from Australia, note the Australian rating down there at the bottom, and one that opens differently here. This one is actually from Israel. These open differently. They open kind of reverse of what you would expect for most VHS cases. The front is the big thick part, and the back is the thin part here, and they do have a very different looking label there as well. Then we have one I find kind of cool. This one is actually from Russia. So it is another box. In this case, it folds open and it's just the cassette on the inside, rather than having a case with the cassette on the inside. So kind of different there. My box is pretty beat up at this point, but different. Then we have one here, also in a clamshell. This one is from France, and this gives us a chance to talk about something I don't think we've really dealt with in depth before. There are basically three different standards, formats you might call them, of home video releases for standard definition in this era, depending on your region. If you're in the US or Japan, places like that, your format was NTSC. And that is basically 30 frames per second of the actual, like, how fast the frames are moving. And then it's pulling down 525 scan lines worth of picture data, picture information, but 480 of those are what are visible on your screen. Hence, 480 as part of the resolution that we tend to think of as standard definition. In pretty much all the rest of the world, you're going to see what's referred to as PAL. PAL instead is 25 frames per second. And with PAL, you basically are getting 625 scan lines of information being delivered, but what's actually on your screen is 576. Now, you may recall we've talked about this before a little bit. In the case of NTSC, remember we had to have time-compressed LaserDiscs. because you needed to be able to fit the entire film on just two sides of a CLV LaserDisc. Well, NTSC is 30 frames per second. It's actually more like 29.97, but basically 30 frames per second. So they had to do that 3:2 pull down thing to try to get us to an actual viewable version, right? Because the film itself is 24 frames per second originally. How do you get that to 30? You do some conversion. And in the process, that's when they would do the time compression. In the case of PAL, 24 versus 25 is not a very big difference. So to get from the regular 24 frames per second of the theatrical film into 25 for PAL, you just slightly speed it up. But that is why you can sometimes see, for instance, on PAL LaserDiscs, they can fit more stuff onto a LaserDisc side than you can in the US because it's sped up a little bit. The audio pitch is a little bit higher on PAL than it is on NTSC because it's not converted, it's just sped up. But in France, you got C-Cam for example, your VHS releases. C-Cam is the same frame rate and resolution as what you would see out of PAL, except it handles color information in a different way. So it is a separate format. It stands for, well, you know what? I'm not even going to try to say this in French. It translates as sequential color with /and memory. C-Cam, sequential color and memory. I don't actually have a lot of C-Cam releases in my collection, but this is one of them. But of course, any look at the Phantom Menace in 2000 has to include Japan, where of course you had a full screen VHS release and you had a widescreen VHS release. That in and of itself isn't special, but boy is the other item. Japan got a LaserDisc release, taking the OB off here, of the Phantom Menace. It was their last Star Wars LaserDisc release alongside that 2000 original trilogy set that we just saw. And it's the region that actually got Phantom Menace on LaserDisc, allowing for this to enter the collections of collectors who were disappointed by the fact that the US did not get the Phantom Menace on LaserDisc. Because again, this is NTSC. It's out of Japan. You can play it on American players. This is widescreen, as one would expect. It is extended play, which means it is two discs, which are actually on either side of this folding jacket, with a little insert inside. And the insert is actually pretty cool because it features one of the cool things about this LaserDisc release in that it has Dolby Digital 5.1 EX sound. The Japanese LaserDisc is by far the best way to watch the original theatrical version of The Phantom Menace. Why do I say theatrical version? Yeah, it's going to change when it hits DVD. All the ones we're looking at here, theatrical version. Either widescreen or full screen. The full screen, I guess, isn't theatrical because it's freaking full screen, which sucks. Widescreen captures it all. But to round out the Phantom Menace, we should also look at some other disc-based items, and those are VCDs. Just like we saw for the original trilogy, VCD was kind of spreading at this point. Again, it's sort of a middle ground between the analog format on cassette with magnetic tape for VHS and the eventual digital format that we would see with DVD for Star Wars starting the next year. Here, kind of trapped in the middle, is this odd digital format with bad compression, played on dedicated players, some DVD players, computers, and so on, that really never hit the United States. Again, VCD. In the VCD arena, we have quite a few releases for the Phantom Menace very quickly. We have one here from Malaysia. You'll notice there that I was having to hold it closed because all this is a crappy little cardboard flap over the two jewel cases for the actual film. Again, the film on two discs, just like with the original trilogy, only in this case, each disc gets a jewel case instead of it being one jewel case holding two discs. That same crappy format applies to the packaging from Indonesia, where, again, it is two jewel cases for the discs, and then just a little crappy piece of frickin' cardboard, not even really thick cardboard, just cardstock slapped over it. I know the cardstock part was meant to basically be thrown away and you kept the jewel cases, but I'm a collector. I want something I can collect in full, and these are some pretty flimsy things to try to collect. You had more sturdy options coming out of Hong Kong, where you had two different versions. This here is a subtitled version, but even though the packaging looks the same, it's a nice, super thick cardboard, almost too thick cardboard, little opening case here with the jewel cases for the two discs on the inside. They also offered a Cantonese dubbed version in similar packaging here. Again, just opening up a nice thick case. Now there is another one for us to look at here for the Phantom Menace. I actually think this probably got released a little bit later, maybe around 2002-ish, but it's hard to say because the only copyright dates on it are for 2000. So we'll just look at it here just to cover our bases, and that is this. A much fancier Hong Kong version of the Phantom Menace on VCD that will match what we'll see coming out of Hong Kong for Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith, for one of the nicest VCD sets I have ever seen. This particular one is the original English version with Chinese subtitles, as it says, so it's essentially kind of like this one here. But it's just a nice sort of digibook, I think you call it, format here, digipack, whatever, with your discs on the inside. So now just one case for both discs, but a really nice case here. Definitely feels more premium than the other ones, for sure. Whereas, I believe, as the French would say, since we were talking about French, I believe the French would call the ones from Malaysia and Indonesia a chité. They are very chité in terms of their packaging. Or maybe that's not French, maybe that's just an American trying too hard. And lest I forget, because I totally almost did, and I'm now recording this teeny tiny piece here in the evening on the day that I recorded, you know, everything else, places really were trying to get you to pre-order this film. So we saw that little special package there from the UK with the little store display VHS type case. Well, you had folks running around wearing pins to promote it. If you went to Sam Goody or OnQ or MediaPlay or Suncoast, you could put in a pre-order and have it on like a little card that would be something that you could keep after the fact. If you went to Best Buy, though, and you did a pre-order reservation, you actually got a full copy, except for the packaging, of the Star Wars Episode 1 Insider's Guide CD-ROM, which is actually some really cool stuff, lots of images and whatnot, kind of a treasure trove of information prior to heavy internet use for this kind of stuff. It was the real deal, and actually had an offer on the back if you wanted to tear up the card, or if you bought any of these other games, that is Jedi Knight Dark Forces 2, the X-Wing Collector's Series, Star Wars Rogue Squadron 3D, X-Wing Alliance, Star Wars Episode 1 Racer, or Star Wars Episode 1 The Phantom Menace, you could get a free copy of Star Wars Behind the Magic, which was really awesome because Behind the Magic, aside from just being a great resource for the trilogy, is actually where we got our first glimpses of some of those deleted scenes that didn't hit home video until the complete saga years later. So Insider's Guide, originally this is the retail box for it, essentially, but this was just that package you could get for reserving there at Best Buy. And then Behind the Magic, if you had taken them up on the offer, would have been something like this. Now we return to earlier today. Moving away from releases of the Phantom Menace film in 2000. That gets us into another Phantom Menace item, though. That is this coming out of the UK. This is behind the scenes of Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, relatively sought after as a home video item because it was only available through the UK version of the Star Wars Fan Club. This year also sees the second VHS release of the mythology of Star Wars with George Lucas and Bill Moyers. It sees the first US release on VHS of The Best of the Muppet Show, Volume 2, which includes the Mark Hamill Star Wars spoof episode. I would note that this is from Time Life Video. We will see a reissue of this from a different distributor, but this is the Time Life Video version that kicks it off. Lastly, that brings us into parodies to look at two very quickly here. We've seen really one main parody that we've really focused on here, and that was when Hardware Wars got an initial VHS release, and that was just because that was such a big deal that Hardware Wars as a fan-made parody got any kind of release at all. There's sort of a second generation of fan films out there, the initial internet generation out there, really spearheaded by Kevin Rubio with Troops, a Cops parody. That little parody, with some different music and whatnot kind of tweaked for release, actually gets an official release on a little DVD sampler type thing here with the first issue of Total Movie Magazine. Yes, it's a magazine about movies. It makes it look like it should be something like Maxim. It's not. It's a movie magazine. But yes, you can find Troops on its DVD. And finally, the other parody we should note here is that this year sees the first DVD release of Spaceballs. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time on Spaceballs and look at all of its different releases. The key thing here is that from here on, we will basically see the same content of this DVD reissued all the way into at least 2024. But that is not the actual disc that is re-released, because this version in 2000 has labels on both sides. They're these ugly flipper discs, as we will see, that have content on either side that you actually have to flip, and the only label is around the ring. But this one in 2000 has a label on both sides. This will not be the one that's reissued constantly, but the content will be. Anybody who watches my From the Star Wars Home Video Library knows how much I love how often they have reissued the DVD that'll come shortly after this one. Whew! And that, folks, is 2000 in Star Wars Home Video. We could have looked at some other oddball items like the AFI 100 Years 100 movies, television specials as a DVD set or VHS. There's oddball items we could see, but we want to focus on kind of the mainline stuff or the stuff that's going to have reiterations or reissues in future years, like what we saw there with the Muppet Show. But it's a year of endings, though, right? We see the last of the LaserDisc coming out of Japan. We see the last VHS releases of the original trilogy, essentially worldwide. And from the standpoint of new beginnings, we're seeing the prequel trilogy hitting home video. We're seeing VCD. But we haven't seen Star Wars releases on DVD yet. That was what people were clamoring for when we saw this VHS release all across the world of The Phantom Menace. We wouldn't have to wait too long for The Phantom Menace on DVD because that would come up the following year. So join us next time as we take a look at 2001.